night before my father's retirement gala, his assistant of 22 years pulled me aside in the parking garage and said, very quietly, "Don't let them seat you at the family table tonight." I almost laughed. I said, "That's a strange thing to say, Gerald." He said, "Just trust me. Sit near the back and listen." Gerald has worked for my father since before I was born. He drove me to piano lessons when I was 9. He was at my university graduation when my father wasn't. He is not a dramatic man. He is the least dramatic person I've ever met. So when he said those words with that particular stillness in his eyes, I didn't argue. I found a seat near the back of the banquet hall, between a regional VP I barely knew and an empty chair, and I waited. "My name is Sable. I'm 31. I'm the older daughter, the practical one, the one who stayed in Vancouver, while my younger sister Lydia moved to Toronto and built a life that looked better in photographs. I work in commercial real estate. I have my broker's license. I've spent the last 4 years quietly helping my father's property management company stay solvent, because when the market shifted in 2020 and 2 of his biggest commercial tenants walked away from their leases, it was my contacts, my nights on the phone, my renegotiated terms that kept the portfolio from collapsing. I did this because he's my father. I did this because I thought that's what family does. I didn't do it for recognition. But I also didn't expect what came next. The retirement gala was being held at the Fairmont downtown, the kind of venue my father would have called wasteful 10 years ago. 200 guests, open bar, a string quartet in the corner playing songs nobody was really listening to. The company was being handed over, he'd said, to the next generation. He'd been vague about the details. There were documents he'd mentioned. Restructuring. Tax efficiency. He would explain everything at dinner. Every difficult conversation in my family got postponed to after the next event, after the holidays, after the move, after the wedding. Now, apparently after the gala. Gerald sat near the staff entrance across the room. He didn't look at me, but I watched him. At 7:40, my brother-in-law Marcus walked in, Lydia's husband, the one who'd spent most of their marriage being described by my mother as tremendously ambitious. He shook my father's hand for a long time. Not the handshake of someone arriving, the handshake of someone who already knew the outcome. At 7:50, my sister arrived. She looked beautiful, which she always does, and she kissed my cheek and said, "I'm so glad you're here." And something about the way she said it felt like a closing door. I smiled and found my seat near the back. The speeches started at 8:30. My father at the podium. Silver-haired, composed, the kind of man who could make a room feel like it owed him something just by entering it. He talked about 30 years of building, about legacy, about the sacrifices the whole family made. Then he said my name. "Sable," he said warmly into the microphone, "the foundation, the one who quietly held everything together." The room applauded. I sat very still. He continued, "And now, with gratitude and pride, I'm announcing the formal transfer of Ashford Property Group to the next generation of leadership." A screen behind him lit up. Marcus. Signed documents. A photograph of Marcus and my father shaking hands in an office I didn't recognize, with a date stamp in the corner from 3 weeks ago. "Effective immediately," my father said. "Marcus will assume controlling ownership, with Lydia as co-director." My name was not on that screen. I had co-signed the operating line of credit 18 months ago when the bank required a second guarantor with industry credentials. I had personally negotiated the lease renewals on the Burnaby portfolio that kept the company's revenue above the threshold for its business insurance. I held signing authority on 4 active vendor contracts because my father had asked me to, because it was easier, because I understood the terms better than anyone else in the room. None of that was mentioned. I did not make a scene. I picked up my water glass and I took a slow sip, and I thought about Gerald's face in the parking garage, that specific stillness, and I understood that he had known. He had known for weeks, and the only way he could protect me was to put me somewhere I could hear it without being expected to perform joy. I danced once with my father that night. He said, "You understand this is just a formality. You'll always be part of this." I nodded like someone who believed him. I said goodnight to Lydia, who hugged me and said, "It's gonna be so good, all of us working together." I nodded again. I said goodnight to Gerald on my way out. I stopped beside him and I said, "Thank you." Just that. He nodded once, the way he always does, and I walked to my car. I drove home to my apartment and kids, and I sat at my kitchen table with my coat still on, and I did not cry. I opened my laptop. Pain when it's clean doesn't feel like pain right away. It feels like clarity. I had been meticulous over the years in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with habit. I kept copies of everything, every email, every signed document, every contract amendment with my name on it. I kept them in a folder system I'd built for tax purposes, because I am the kind of person who prepares for audits that never come. I opened that folder now. The cosign on the operating line of credit, my name, my credentials, my liability. 18 months of personal exposure should the company default. The bank had my signature on file. The bank also had a clause, standard, one I had read carefully at the time, that required written notification to all signatories before the operating line could be restructured or transferred. There had been no notification. That was the first thread. The vendor contracts were the second. 4 active agreements: commercial cleaning, electrical maintenance, HVAC service, security monitoring. All 4 had a clause I had insisted on when I negotiated them, a dual authorization requirement for any changes to payment terms or service scope. I had insisted on it because 2 years earlier, a vendor had tried to quietly change billing cycles, and my father hadn't noticed for 3 months. Dual authorization was my solution. My name was still the second signature. No authorization from me had been sought for the transfer of those contracts. That was the second thread. The third was quieter but more significant. 18 months ago, when we were stabilizing the Burnaby leases, I had filed updated beneficial ownership documentation with the BC Registry as part of the lender's requirement. I had listed myself as a temporary authorized representative for operational matters. That registration had never been updated, because nobody had thought to ask me to update it. I wasn't angry anymore by midnight. I was mapping. I made a list. I made a second list. I made a cup of tea and I stood at my kitchen window looking at the water. And I thought about all the times in my life I had been told that I was the responsible one, like it was a compliment and not a strategy. I thought about what Gerald had risked, telling me what he told me. He could have said nothing. He could have watched me sit at the family table and receive that announcement with a full glass of champagne in my hand and no room to think. He chose not to. He had worked for my father for 22 years and he had chosen me. I was not going to waste that. Monday morning, 9 a.m., Marcus sent a company-wide email introducing himself as the new owner of Ashford Property Group. He CC'd the vendors. He CC'd the bank. He did not CC me. At 9:15, I forwarded a letter to the bank's commercial lending division. Polite. Factual. I am writing to flag that the operating line of credit on account ending 7742 carries my co-signature, and I have not received the required written notification of any ownership transfer, as stipulated in Section 4.3 of the Guarantee Agreement. Please confirm the current status of this guarantee and advise on next steps. At 9:30, I sent a separate note to each of the 4 vendors. Not confrontational, just a heads up. This is to confirm that per the dual authorization clause in our service agreement, any changes to payment structure or contract holder will require written sign-off from both listed parties. Please note I have not yet received or approved any such changes. I did not send these from anger. I sent them from the folder I'd been keeping for 3 years, with the clause numbers cited correctly, in plain language, with no emotional charge whatsoever. At 10:02, Marcus texted me. "What did you send the bank?" At 10:15, my father called. I let it ring. At 10:41, the bank's commercial team replied to my email. Thank you for your inquiry. We are placing a temporary hold on restructuring proceedings, pending clarification of the guarantee obligations. Please expect contact from our legal team within 2 business days. I read that email 3 times. Then I made a second cup of tea. At 11, Lydia called. I picked up this time. She said, "Sable, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm protecting my interests." She said, "This is Dad's retirement. This is my future. You're going to ruin everything." I said, "I was never consulted about this restructuring. My name is on documents that carry legal liability. I have a right to be consulted." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always have to make everything so complicated." I said, "The complexity existed before I sent that email, Lydia. I just didn't pretend otherwise." She hung up. By Tuesday afternoon, the HVAC vendor had responded to my note. They were requesting a meeting before processing the new payment authorization. They were very apologetic about it, very Canadian about it, but they needed both signatures before proceeding. The cleaning company replied the same day, electrical by Wednesday morning. Marcus was texting me every few hours at this point, then not texting me, then texting again. On Wednesday evening, he came to my building. I spoke to him through the intercom. He said, "You're doing this out of spite." I said, "I'm doing this because I was a named guarantor on a $600,000 operating line of credit, and nobody told me it was being transferred. That's not spite. That's basic legal exposure." He said, "We were going to tell you after." I said, "After what, Marcus?" He didn't answer that. I said, "I think you should go home." My father showed up Thursday evening. He stood in my living room and he looked around it like he was seeing it for the first time, like he was noticing for the first time that I had built a real life in here, that there were bookshelves and a good sofa and photographs on the wall, and none of them included him. He said, "This has gone far enough." I said, "I agree. That's why I want to resolve it properly." He said, "You want to punish me." I said, "No, I want to be acknowledged. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I thought you'd understand. You've always been the one who understands." That sentence sat in the air between us for a moment. I said, "I do understand, Dad. That's the problem." He asked me what I wanted. I had a folder ready. I slid it across the coffee table. Inside was a buyout proposal, not for the company. I didn't want the company. I wanted what was mine, a formal release of personal guarantee on the operating line, a consulting fee agreement for the Burnaby lease work that had been performed without compensation, and a one-time structured payment that reflected the value of the operational contributions I had made during the restructuring period. I had calculated it conservatively. I had had a lawyer look at it, not to threaten, but because I was done doing things informally. I also included a letter to the BC Registry updating the beneficial ownership records. I had already drafted it. All it needed was a witness signature and it would be filed. He read the folder carefully. He is a careful reader when the stakes are real. He said, "This will take time." I said, "I know, I'm not in a hurry, but the bank hold stays in place until it's resolved, and the vendor authorizations stay pending until I sign off. I want to be fair. I'm asking you to be fair too." Lydia texted me that night. Just, "Was this your plan all along?" I didn't reply right away. I thought about it. Then I wrote back, "No. My plan was to be part of this family." She read it and didn't respond. The settlement took 11 days. My father's lawyer and my lawyer exchanged documents on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, the terms were finalized. The personal guarantee was released. The consulting fee was paid. The structured payment was transferred to my account in 2 installments, the second arriving on a gray November morning when I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop in Mount Pleasant, engine running, watching the rain come in off the mountains. I called Gerald that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "I wanted to thank you properly." He said, "You don't need to." I said, I know I don't need to. I want to. You could have said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've worked for your father a long time. I watched you work harder than anyone in that company, and I watched everyone look right past it. That wasn't right. It was never right. I said, Are you okay with everything? He said, I'm retiring in the spring. Your father actually agreed to a very decent package. I think the lawyers made it easier for him to be generous. I laughed. He laughed too, a little. I said, If you ever want coffee, Gerald, you call me. He said he would. I believe he will. I withdrew my BC registry filing. There was no point in it anymore. I sent a brief note to the vendors confirming the transition could proceed. I sent the bank a letter releasing my guarantee. Everything was clean and documented and professional. Lydia and I haven't spoken properly since, not because of anger exactly, but because I think we both finally understand something we'd been pretending not to understand for years. She needed me to stay small, and I had stayed small for a long time, because I thought that was love. It isn't. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. My father called me on my birthday in January. He said, Happy birthday. He said, I hope you're well. He said, I miss you. I said, I miss you too, Dad. And I meant it, which is the complicated part. You can miss someone and still refuse to be erased by them. Those two things can both be true at once. I'm not angry at him. I'm something quieter than angry. I'm awake in a way I wasn't before. I started my own firm in February, small for now. Commercial leasing, tenant representation, some investment advisory on the side. I have 3 clients already. I have a website that Gerald called very professional when I sent him the link. I have a glass of wine every Friday evening at my kitchen table with a view of the mountains, and I think about how long I spent making myself useful to people who were counting on me not to notice what that was costing me. The night before my father's retirement gala, Gerald told me not to sit at the family table. He was right. I had spent years sitting at that table and thinking it meant something, thinking that proximity was the same as belonging. It isn't. Belonging is something you build yourself, on ground that nobody can take from you. I don't fund other people's legacies anymore. I'm building my own. I think about Gerald a lot. Not about what he said exactly, but about what it cost him to say it. 22 years with my father, a retirement package he still needed, a loyalty that ran in 2 directions at once, and he chose mine anyway. There's something in that I keep coming back to. The idea that integrity isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet decision made in a parking garage when nobody is watching and nothing is guaranteed. What happened to my family wasn't unusual, if I'm honest. It's a pattern that plays out in families everywhere, in companies, in friendships. Someone works hard and stays quiet, and the people around them start to count on the quiet. They start to build on it. They start to assume it has no limit. And for a long time, I let them assume that because I thought being needed was the same as being valued. It isn't. Those are 2 entirely different things. And the gap between them is where a lot of people lose years of their lives. I don't think my father is a cruel man. I think he made choices that were convenient, and convenience has a way of becoming cruelty over time, without anyone quite deciding that's what it is. Lydia didn't wake up one morning planning to erase me. She just wanted what she wanted, and I was in the way, and it was easier not to think about it too hard. That's how most harm happens, not from malice, but from the slow accumulation of not looking. What I learned, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, with my coat still on, is that clear thinking is its own kind of protection, not coldness. I want to be careful about that distinction. I wasn't cold. I was precise. There's a difference between shutting your feelings down and simply refusing to let them make decisions for you. The documents in my folder were the result of years of habits I'd built, not out of suspicion, but out of care. I kept records because I was thorough. I insisted on dual authorization because I'd seen what happened without it. I understood the clauses because I had written them. None of that was strategy in the moment. It became strategy because I had done the right thing consistently for years before I ever needed it to protect me. That's what I mean when I say that doing things properly, even when no one is watching, even when no one seems to care, builds something real. It built the ground I was standing on when everything else shifted. And then there was the harder part, the part where you have to decide what you actually want. Not what feels satisfying in the short term, not the scene you could make, the things you could say. What do you actually want your life to look like when this is over? I wanted my name off a liability I hadn't agreed to carry. I wanted to be compensated fairly for work I had done. I wanted to leave cleanly, with my reputation intact and my conscience clear. That required more discipline than anger ever could. It required me to sit with the hurt and still make measured choices, one at a time, without letting the story I was telling myself about the injustice override the practical reality of what needed to happen. I called Gerald in November, from a parking lot in the rain. He said he'd watched me work harder than anyone in that company and watched everyone look right past it. He said it wasn't right, it was never right. That was all the acknowledgement I needed in the end. Not an announcement, not a standing ovation, just one person who had been paying attention saying quietly, "I saw you." I think that's enough to build from. I think that's always been enough.